13 men were told they were going to die on the same morning in the same room. A Catholic priest had the job of reading out which of them it would be. What he wrote down afterward is a literal fact. Every man who heard he would live broke into tears. Every man who heard he would hang got down on his knees, dry-eyed, and thanked God. That was the 22nd of September, 1834, on Norfolk Island, and it remains one of the strangest scenes any chaplain recorded anywhere in the British Empire. 9 of their headstones still stand in the cemetery today. This is the story of an island, where dying was sometimes the reward. This is Norfolk Island. Norfolk Island was not built for punishment the first time. Captain James Cook charted it in 1774 and reported 2 things worth a colony: pine trees tall and straight enough for a warship's mast, and a native flax that might be spun into rope and sail canvas without importing either from Europe. Governor Arthur Phillip took the hint seriously. Within weeks of landing the first fleet at Sydney, he sent Lieutenant Philip Gidley King and a small party of convicts and free settlers to secure the island before France could claim it. King landed on the 6th of March, 1788, less than 2 months after Sydney itself was founded, and began clearing ground at what is now Kingston. The island itself made the case for isolation before anyone built anything on it. It sits 1,676 kilometers northeast of Sydney, in open Pacific water with no other significant land nearby. A single volcanic outcrop, roughly 8 kilometers long and 5 wide, ringed mostly by cliffs rather than beaches. No ship could reach it without weeks of warning, and no convict could leave it without a vessel. Nobody was going to. Hand him. That isolation was the entire point of choosing it twice. Once for a colony, Britain hoped would be self-sufficient, and once, decades later, for one it hoped would be inescapable. The plan did not survive contact with the actual trees. The pine's timber was full of knots that made it unsuitable for the straight, load-bearing masts the Navy needed. The flax turned out to require a processing technique nobody on the island knew how to perform at scale. On paper, Norfolk Island was meant to supply the fleet. In practice, it supplied almost nothing the fleet could use. The population grew anyway, mostly because the island could grow food, and Sydney, in its earliest years, sometimes could not feed itself. By November 1791, there were 748 convicts living on the island, more than the entire free population of the mainland colony at the time. Then Sydney's own farms began to produce, and the reason for Norfolk Island's existence quietly disappeared. By 1810, the population had fallen to under 200. Governor Lachlan Macquarie, newly arrived and inclined toward tidiness, ordered the settlement wound down entirely. The last convicts and settlers left on the 28th of February, 1814. Before they left, the buildings were pulled down or burned so that no rival power could make use of them. For 11 years, Norfolk Island belonged to nobody. Then in 1824, the colonial administration in New South Wales had a different problem, and it remembered the empty island. By the 1820s, transportation to Australia had solved one problem for Britain and created another. Convicts who reoffended once they arrived in the colonies had nowhere further to be sent, short of hanging them, which Britain was trying, with limited success, to do less of. Governor Ralph Darling wanted somewhere to put the men the colonial courts kept convicting a second and third time, somewhere far enough from Sydney that its reputation alone would frighten men into behaving before a single lash was ever thrown. He did not disguise the purpose in careful language, the way later administrators sometimes did. Norfolk Island, he wrote, was to be held out as a place of the extremest punishment, short of death. Short is doing a lot of work in that phrase. Under the regulations that followed, a man's original sentence could be doubled by further offenses committed on the island itself, and since almost everyone sent there had already reoffended once to get there, an original term of years could become a life sentence without a judge ever using the word life. None of this was improvised. Transportation to Australia had been running for nearly 4 decades by the 1820s, long enough to develop its own internal logic. A first offense sent a man to Australia, a second offense, committed once he was already there, sent him somewhere worse again. Norfolk Island sat at the bottom of that ladder, the last rung before the gallows, and every colonial court understood exactly what naming it in a sentence meant, even when the paperwork itself used only the dry language of relocation. There are dozens more colonies like this one still to cover. Subscribing means the next one arrives without any searching required. On the 6th of June, 1825, Major Richard Turton landed at Kingston with 34 soldiers, 12 soldiers' wives and children, and 57 convicts. The buildings the first settlement had left behind, or what was left of them after Macquarie's order, gave the new arrivals somewhere to start. They were not there to grow flax. They were there to build something Britain had never quite managed to build correctly the first time, a prison with no plausible way out. It very nearly succeeded. The buildings went up fast because the population did. By 1829, there were 211 convicts on the island. 5 years later, there were close to 700. Lieutenant Colonel James Morissette took command in 1829 and ran the settlement with a level of severity that later commandants would be measured against, favorably or not. Major Joseph Anderson followed him in 1834, and under Anderson, the settlement finally got the buildings its reputation had already outgrown. The commissariat store, new military barracks in stone rather than timber, and the beginning of what would become the new jail. Each of these buildings answered a question the first settlement had never had to ask, because the first settlement was never designed to hold people who did not want to be there. The commissariat controlled supply. The barracks controlled the guards. The jail, still years from completion, would eventually control the prisoners, down to the level of the individual cell. Norfolk Island was being built, one structure at a time, around a single function its geography had already made nearly impossible on its own, keeping men from leaving. None of this construction happened by accident of layout. A commissariat store centralized every ration, every tool, every length of rope. Nothing moved without passing through a point the administration controlled. The barracks put soldiers between the convict work gangs and the sea. The jail, when it was finally finished in 1847, was built with separate cells rather than communal. Wards, on a theory borrowed from prison reformers in England, that men left alone with their own thoughts reformed faster than men left together to plan. Punishment did not wait for the architecture to catch up. The instrument of choice was the cat o' nine tails, 9 knotted leather cords bound to a single handle, and the regulation allowed anywhere from 50 to 100 lashes per offense, with the offenses themselves ranging from theft down to talking back to an overseer. 5 strokes were usually enough to draw blood. By the time you reached 50, the number itself had stopped meaning anything specific. Men were flogged for insolence, for slow work, for singing, for being too sick to work, and then separately, for being too sick to eat the rations the illness had made them unable to keep down. Every one of those floggings was recorded in a punishment book. Offense and lash count entered side by side, as methodically as the settlement recorded rainfall or rations issued. The paperwork did not distinguish between a man punished for stealing food and a man punished for the crime of having asked to see a doctor. Both entries used the same column. Here's the part that the punishment book does not explain on its own. None of this was hidden. The floggings were carried out in public, in a yard the whole settlement could see, on a schedule the whole settlement knew in advance. Deterrence, as the administration understood it, required an audience. A flogging nobody witnessed taught nobody anything, and that was the point. By then, the island's reputation had started to travel back to the mainland on its own, carried by the crews of the supply ships and by the letters of the soldiers stationed there. Being sentenced to Norfolk Island was, by the early 1830s, understood in every court in New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land as a sentence categorically worse than the years attached to it on paper. Judges used the threat of it in sentencing. So did magistrates, informally, long before a case ever reached a courtroom. And still, every ship that arrived brought more men who had tested the threat and lost. The construction, in other words, kept pace with the demand the colony's own courts kept generating. Every new conviction for a crime committed inside New South Wales fed the island's population. Every escalation in punishment on the island fed the island's reputation. A reputation vicious enough would, in theory, eventually stop needing new material to sustain itself, because nobody would risk the sentence that led there. The reports written from Norfolk Island in these years rarely mention conscience, and the same is true of nearly every penal colony the empire ever built beyond its own shores. They mention cost and capacity and the arithmetic of feeding several hundred more men than the island's farms were built to support. When commandants asked London for more resources, they framed the request in terms of order and productivity, not mercy. When London eventually questioned the settlement's value decades later, it asked about expense first. The moral argument against a place like this one existed the entire time it was operating. Chaplains made it. The occasional sympathetic magistrate made it. But the argument that actually closed penal colonies was almost never that one. It was always the ledger. It did not work that way. Reputations do not deter men who have already run out of alternatives, and by the mid-1830s, Norfolk Island's convict population was made up almost entirely of men who had already run out of alternatives once. The buildings kept growing. So did the appetite, on both sides, for confrontation. A day on Norfolk Island in these years followed a shape that barely varied. Work parties went out at first light to the fields, the quarry, or the lime kilns, and returned at dusk to rations that were, by every surviving account, never quite enough for the labor being extracted for them. Overseers, many of them convicts themselves, promoted for cooperation rather than skill, reported infractions up a chain that ended eventually in the yard with the cat-o'-nine tails. Sundays brought a church service that few of the men attending believed was for their benefit. The work itself varied by sentence and by season, clearing timber in the early years, building roads and drains later, quarrying stone once the new jail was underway. None of it was designed to produce anything beyond the settlement's own upkeep. Norfolk Island under the second settlement was never meant to be self-sufficient the way the first one had tried to be. It existed to hold men and extract labor from them in roughly equal measure, and the administration kept careful records of both. How many days worked, how many rations issued, how many lashes given. The one thing the records rarely tracked with the same precision was how many men simply stopped functioning. The ones who, by every informal account from the period, stopped being useful either as laborers or as examples and were simply left to occupy space until their sentences on paper expired. It was not a system built to last without incident, and it did not. In September 1826, a convict known to the settlement as Black John Goff organized the first serious attempt to break it. Goff arranged for 2 men to stage a fake escape attempt as a decoy, drawing off most of the soldiers on duty. While the garrison chased the decoys, roughly 50 other convicts overpowered their overseers, broke into the stores for provisions, and launched 3 boats. 1 soldier was bayoneted to death in the confusion. Several more were wounded. The escaping convicts made for the nearby, uninhabited Phillip Island, 7 kilometers offshore, believing, on information that turned out to be wrong, that there was land within 100 miles where they could disappear permanently. There was not. They were run down within days. Goff and 2 other ringleaders, William Moore and Edward Watson, were shipped to Sydney and hanged there in 1827. At his trial, Goff spoke at length about the hardships he had endured and his love of liberty. The presiding judge was not moved by either argument and said so before passing sentence. 3 months after Goff's attempt failed, a different group of convicts tried a different method entirely. In December 1826, 66 men being transported to Norfolk Island aboard the brig, Wellington seized the ship itself before it ever reached the island, overpowering the crew and 20 soldiers guarding them. 1 convict appointed himself captain. Another took the role of first mate. A third, known on the island only by the nickname Flash Jack, took the role of second mate, and a 4th became steward. It was a full command structure, improvised in a matter of hours by men who had never sailed anything larger than a rowboat. For a short time, the Wellington was, in every practical sense, a pirate vessel crewed by British convicts, sailing under nobody's flag but their own, and it was heading of all places toward New Zealand. The improvisation held until a storm forced the mutineers to rely on the very sailors they had just taken prisoner to keep the ship afloat. By the time the Wellington reached the Bay of Islands, a whaling crew there had been warned, and the uprising ended not in a courtroom, but in a boarding action at sea. The paperwork behind these settlements runs deep, and there's a lot more of it still to go through on this channel. Neither mutiny changed the settlement's daily operation in any way that shows up in the official returns. What they changed was the calculation every new arrival made on the voyage out. That escape, however unlikely, was worth the attempt because the alternative was a sentence with no natural end written into it. In January 1834, more than 100 men tested that calculation at once. On the 15th of January 1834, more than 100 convicts rose at once in the most direct assault the settlement had yet faced. The plan was simple and almost worked. Seize the guards, take control of the government vessel expected any day with supplies, and sail for anywhere that was not Norfolk Island. It did not survive contact with the garrison. Soldiers put the rising down within hours. 29 men were convicted afterward for their part in it. 13 of them were sentenced to hang. The task of telling each man which side of that number he had landed on fell to a Catholic priest, Father William Ullathorne, the Vicar General of Sydney, who had been sent to the island specifically to prepare the condemned. He later called it the most heart-rending scene he had ever witnessed, and what he recorded afterward reads, less like an execution report than a description of a room where every ordinary human reaction had been turned inside out. The reprieved men wept. The condemned men knelt, dry-eyed, and thanked God. That is not a figure of speech, and it was not Ullathorne's interpretation of the scene. It is what he wrote down as a literal fact, because he did not expect anyone reading it afterward to believe him otherwise. 13 men were hanged on the 22nd of September, 1834. 9 of their headstones are still standing in the cemetery at Kingston. Robert Douglas, Henry Drummond, James Bell, Joseph Butler, and several others among the names still legible on the stone. The other 4 are gone, but the record of who is buried beneath the unmarked ground is not. Ullathorne stayed on the island for 6 months afterward, and the account he gave later to a House of Commons committee on transportation became one of the pieces of testimony London could not entirely dismiss, even though it would take another 13 years to act on it. Britain had by this point run an experiment in extreme punishment for 9 years and produced exactly one measurable result. Convicts willing to die to end a sentence that punishment could not otherwise end for them. In London, a small number of people had begun to notice. In 1840, one of them was sent to the island to try something different. His name was Alexander Maconochie. Maconochie was not the obvious choice for the job, and that was rather the point. He was a retired Royal Navy captain, a founding member of the Royal Geographical Society, and unlike every commandant who had preceded him on Norfolk Island, a man who had spent years as a prisoner of war himself, held by the French during the Napoleonic Wars. He arrived in March 1840 on the recommendation of a parliamentary committee that had concluded cautiously that punishment alone was not producing better men, only more broken ones. He had not planned a life in penal administration. Maconochie was raised in the household of an aristocratic relative, entered the Royal Navy as a midshipman at 14, and served through the Napoleonic Wars before his own capture and imprisonment, an experience almost no other commandant sent to Norfolk Island shared with the men under him. After the wars, he married, raised a family of 7 children, and helped found the Royal Geographical Society in London, well before anyone in the colonial office thought to send him anywhere near a prison. Maconochie's answer was a system he called marks. Instead of a fixed sentence served passively, a convict earned marks for labor, good conduct, and education, and lost them for infractions. Enough marks accumulated honestly bought a man privileges, then reduced supervision, then eventually freedom. On a schedule he controlled through his own behavior, rather than one imposed on him by a judge who was no longer paying attention. It was, in Maconochie's own account, and in the assessment of the reformers who studied it for the rest of the century, an attempt to make reform, rather than suffering, the actual purpose of the sentence. Which is to say, for the first time in the settlement's history, a man on Norfolk Island had something to work toward, rather than merely something to survive. The mechanics were specific. A convict began his term owing a set number of marks, calculated from the length of his original sentence. He earned marks daily through labor and conduct, and spent them on food above the basic ration, on privileges, and eventually on release itself, a system closer to a wage than a punishment, run by a man who had spent his own captivity wishing somebody had offered him exactly this kind of arithmetic. Convicts under the mark system were housed separately from the old hands, worked in smaller supervised groups rather than large chained gangs, and were permitted, for the first time on the island, to earn their way toward trust rather than simply serve out a fixed term of distrust. Here's the part that gets left out of the shorter versions of this story. Maconochie was never permitted to apply his system to the whole island. Of roughly 1,800 convicts on Norfolk Island at the time, only about 600, the men sent directly from Britain and Ireland, kept deliberately separate from the rest, were placed under the mark system. The remaining 1,200, the so-called old hands who had already served time in the colonies and reoffended their way to the island, continued to live under the punishment regime Maconochie had been sent there to replace. He ran, in effect, 2 settlements on one island for 4 years, one where a man's future depended on his own conduct, and one where it still depended on nothing at all. By every account that survives from the period, the 600 under the mark system responded exactly as the theory predicted. Discipline improved. Escape attempts dropped. Men who completed the program went on, in significant numbers, to build ordinary lives in the colonies, enough of them that they became known informally as Maconochie's gentlemen. The nickname followed some of them for the rest of their lives, meant sometimes as mockery, and sometimes as the decades passed and Maconochie's reputation was rehabilitated by later reformers as something closer to a badge of honor. None of that saved the experiment. In 1840, not long after arriving, Maconochie organized a celebration for the convicts on Queen Victoria's birthday. Food, some measure of festivity, an afternoon that looked, to anyone watching from a distance, less like a punishment and more like a holiday. Word of it reached the press in Sydney within days, and the coverage was almost uniformly hostile. A colony whose entire social order depended on convict labor, and the threat of Norfolk Island did not want to read that convicts on Norfolk Island were being given parties. The criticism followed Maconochie for the rest of his tenure, growing louder each time a newspaper found a new detail to object to. By 1844, London had heard enough of it. The Colonial Office recalled Maconochie, and his time on Norfolk Island ended that February, 4 years after it began. The men who replaced him did not share his theory of punishment, and neither did the man who arrived 2 years later. His name was John Giles Price. The men who replaced Maconochie did share one thing, a belief that his methods had been the problem, not the solution. Discipline reverted in stages to something close to what it had been before 1840. By 1846, under Major Joseph Childs, conditions on the island had deteriorated to a point that would, within the year, produce the worst single act of violence in the settlement's history. On the 1st of July, 1846, a group of convicts rose against the administration and killed 4 minor officials in the process. The event became known afterward with a bluntness the record rarely allows itself, as the Cooking Pot Uprising, named for the confiscation of the convicts' personal cooking equipment that is generally credited as the immediate trigger, though the underlying grievances went considerably further back than a set of pots. Childs was replaced within weeks. His successor was John Giles Price, and Price was, in almost every respect that mattered to the job, Maconochie's opposite. Price had spent 8 years as a magistrate in Hobart before taking the Norfolk Island posting, and he arrived in August 1846 with no particular sympathy for reform theory and no illusions about what the position required. He was the 4th son of a Cornish baronet, educated at Charterhouse and at Oxford, and had arrived in Von Diemen's Land a decade earlier with letters of introduction from well-placed relatives. He farmed for a time in the Huon Valley, married the daughter of a prominent Hobart family, and worked his way into the colonial administration as a muster master of convicts before being appointed magistrate. Outside his official duties, by every account written about him, he was unusually good with his hands and his head both, a classical scholar who could also turn a lathe, mend a lock, or sew a shirt as well as he could run a farm. None of those talents had anything to do with why the colonial government wanted him on Norfolk Island. He was the only civilian ever to hold the post of commandant there, and he took the position knowing exactly what his predecessor had just failed to survive politically. His first task was to deal with the 26 convicts who stood accused of involvement in the July killings. Somebody had to decide how far responsibility for 4 deaths extended through a crowd of rioting men, and that decision fell to Price. 26 were tried. 12 were hanged in 2 groups of 6 on the same day, the 13th of October, 1846. 5 more were executed within the following 3 weeks, 1 for direct complicity in the killings, 4 for other offenses entirely, folded into the same reckoning because the machinery was already running. The record does not say which of the 26 men actually killed the 4 officials. It says who was hanged for it. Nobody in that chain was required to weigh the 26 against the 4. That was not an accident of the process. It was the process. A commission, a courtroom, a signature. Each step narrowed the question until the only thing left to determine was who would die and on what date. And by the time the question reached that stage, the original count of victims had stopped being the number anyone was actually working from. It did not need to be. However, you total the arithmetic, 26 tried and 12 hanged on one morning does not balance neatly against 4 deaths, and nobody in the chain was ever asked to make it balance. Price governed for 6 more years after that, and the island under him developed a reputation that, by most contemporary accounts, exceeded even its reputation before Maconochie's arrival. A visiting magistrate, Robert Pringle Stewart, produced a report in 1846 that described conditions in language blunt enough to reach the House of Lords when Bishop Robert Wilson carried it there in person after his own visits to the island. Stewart's report described convicts sleeping without adequate blankets through the island's cold season, rations reduced below the official allowance without explanation in the ledgers, and a level of routine violence between prisoners that the administration had stopped bothering to record separately from official punishment. Wilson, appalled by what he saw in his visits, would return to Norfolk Island twice more before the decade was out, each time carrying fresh testimony back to England. For the first time, a British institution outside the colony itself was reading in detail what Norfolk Island had become. One more colony closes every few weeks on this channel. Subscribing keeps that schedule running. By then, the mathematics of the settlement no longer worked in its own favor. 12 men had died on one morning to close a single chapter of the island's unrest, and the closing had not produced order. It had produced a report that reached Parliament. Every escalation, going back to Darling's original instruction in 1825, had been justified as the thing that would finally make the deterrent work. None of it had. The settlement had spent 21 years proving, at increasing cost and increasing visibility, that extreme punishment did not reduce reoffending. It only produced more men willing to die rather than continue serving it, a pattern the island had first demonstrated in 1834, and then, under Price, demonstrated again on a larger scale. That was 1846. The colony would survive for only 9 more years. Read enough of this paperwork and a pattern starts showing up. The reports only change once someone outside the chain of command starts reading them. On paper, the closure that followed was framed as administrative consolidation. In practice, it was the closest thing to an admission the empire ever gave that the deterrent had not worked. In 1847, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies informed the governor of New South Wales that the penal settlement on Norfolk Island was to be abolished. The decision did not arrive quickly, and it did not arrive because of the report Stewart had written the year before, or not directly. It arrived because closing an expensive, badly publicized colony had become easier to justify than continuing to defend one. The wind down took the better part of a decade. Transportation of new convicts slowed through the late 1840s. Sir William Denison, who took over administration of the colonies in the region, formally recommended closure. By October 1854, only 119 convicts remained on an island that had, at its peak, held more than 2,000 at once. In May 1855, the last of them were removed to Van Diemen's Land, along with the small garrison still guarding them. There was no ceremony recorded for the departure, and no acknowledgement in the official correspondence that the settlement had failed at the task it was built for. The final convicts were simply reassigned, like equipment being redistributed between postings. Some of the buildings were earmarked for an incoming community before the last convict ship had even cleared the harbor. The wind down and the resettlement were planned for a period of months as 2 halves of the same administrative transaction. 21 years after Darling had called it a place of the extremest punishment, short of death, Norfolk Island stopped being a place of punishment at all. Price had left before any of that happened. He returned to Hobart in January 1853, 2 years before the final closure, as Britain's intent to abandon the settlement had already become clear. He did not retire from penal administration. In January 1854, he was appointed Inspector General of Prisons in the colony of Victoria, brought in specifically to manage the wave of crime that had followed the gold rushes there, a problem by most accounts considerably larger and less contained than anything Norfolk Island had presented him with, and large enough that colonial newspapers had begun openly asking whether Victoria's prisons were becoming as dangerous as the settlement he had just left. The posting put him in charge of prison hulks moored in Hobson's Bay, and of the work parties like the one at Williamstown, men serving out sentences on public infrastructure projects under armed guard. Price approached the job the way he had approached Norfolk Island, with a reputation for severity that arrived in every yard before he did, and with very little patience for the idea that convicted men deserved to be heard on the subject of their own treatment. On paper, the appointment was a promotion. In practice, it placed him back in exactly the kind of setting where his methods had already produced results. Nobody in London wanted to read about a second time. Price believed he had left Norfolk Island behind him. Norfolk Island had not left him. On the 26th of March, 1857, Price visited the quarry works at Williamstown to hear convict grievances about their rations, walking in among the work gangs with only a small escort, the way he had walked among convicts for most of his career. A group of laborers known as the cartmen, the men who hauled stone from the quarry to the works, pressed forward to be heard. Someone threw a clod of earth. Then came stones. Price raised a hand to protect himself, and the crowd surged. He was knocked down and beaten before his own officers could reach him. A handful of convicts, men serving under the very system he administered, placed him on a wheelbarrow and carried him badly injured to a nearby lighthouse, and from there to a doctor's house in the town. He died the following day, the 27th of March, at the age of 48. 15 convicts were tried for his murder. 7 were hanged. Somebody signed the order that hanged 12 men on Norfolk Island in a single morning in October 1846. 11 years later, on the Australian mainland, in a colony he had gone to in order to escape the reputation that order had earned him, that signature caught up with him anyway. By then, the island itself had already been given to somebody else entirely. On the 8th of June, 1856, before Price ever left for Victoria, while the penal settlement was being formally wound down around him, a ship called the Maconochie arrived at him. Kingston carrying 194 people. They were the entire population of Pitcairn Island, descendants of the Bounty mutineers, and the Tahitian companions who had sailed with them in 1790, relocated by the British government because their home island could no longer support them. What had started in 1790 as 9 mutineers and a handful of Tahitian islanders had grown, over 3 generations, to nearly 200 people crowded onto 2 square miles of arable land, more than the island could feed. An earlier attempt to relocate the community to Tahiti in 1831 had ended in disaster, killing a fifth of the population to disease within months, and the survivors had sailed straight back home rather than stay on. This time, the community spokesman, a lay minister named George Hun Nobes, who had been received by Queen Victoria herself 2 years earlier, called the offer of Norfolk Island Her Majesty's most gracious offer, and the entire community voted to accept it rather than risk another failed move. They stepped off a 5-week voyage into barracks and cell blocks that had been built, stone by stone, by men who had been sent there to be forgotten. Within a year, they were living in the same buildings. Nobody planned that particular irony. The Colonial Office was solving a housing problem for the Pitcairners, with whatever land happened to be sitting vacant, and the fact that this particular vacant land had spent 30 years as one of the harshest prisons in the empire never entered the correspondence as a consideration one way or the other. It was not incidental to the people who moved in. Some of the barracks the Pitcairners occupied were quarried apart for building material within a decade. Others still stand, largely as they were left at what is now called Kingston and Arthur's Vale. By then, most of the officials who had built the settlement's reputation were long dead or retired to postings nobody remembered afterward. In 2010, that same ground was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, one of 11 Australian sites recognized for the same reason: convict transportation and what it built and what it cost. The listing does not single out Norfolk Island as unusual. It groups the island with Port Arthur, with Cockatoo Island, with the old Great North Road built by chain gangs outside. Sydney, 11 places scattered across 2 centuries and half a continent, all built on the same premise Darling had written down in 1825, that a sentence could be made to mean something more than the years attached to it, if the place serving it was harsh enough. Norfolk Island was neither the first nor the last of them. It may simply be the one where the gap between what the empire intended and what actually happened is easiest to measure, because so much of the paperwork survived intact. Walk the grounds today and you will pass headstones with names still legible on them, and a cell block that lost its roof decades ago. Britain called the Second Settlement a place of extreme punishment, and for 30 years it delivered exactly what the phrase promised: no more and no less. It sent thousands of men to an island 8 kilometers long and did not much concern itself with what came back. Some of them are buried under headstones that still stand. More of them are not. The empire that built the punishment did not survive long enough to answer for all of it. The island outlasted every commandant who ever tried to run it. Maconochie tried to change it and was recalled for the attempt. Price enforced it without apology and was killed for that 11 years later in a different colony by different men entirely. Norfolk Island is a tourist destination now. The graves are not. We go inside the places empires built beyond their own borders, one island at a time, and the empires built a great many of them